So you're well equipped, but in the past, because the government really has not had any resource that they could immediately roll out as a national number, and they in the past have put out the Lifeline number. Lifeline, as you know, is a suicide prevention number, and while many of the centers are equipped to do the work, the message of suicide prevention greeting people who have been affected by disasters felt to be, for many, to be very inappropriate. So now we finally have a service that will be here specifically for individuals who've been affected emotionally by disasters. Many of you also know the Oil Spill Distress Helpline was the first major investment that the government made SAMHSA made in terms of providing a national, or at least a broad-scale helpline specific for disasters. Getting some background on this, make sure that you are not on speakerphone, or if you are, that you're on mute and or you've got your door shut. Thank you. The Oil Spill Distress Helpline was launched a little bit over a year ago, and that specifically was funded through BP money and involved about 8 Gulf Coast centers. So because of the success of that line and the work that was done by both Link to Health Solutions and most importantly the 8 centers in the Gulf Coast communities on the ground, SAMHSA had enough faith to make this a national program. And you all will be the first folks who will be applying, to the extent that you're going to move ahead with a proposal, to be a part of a national distress helpline. We've benefited from having staff here to help oversee the Oil Spill Distress Helpline. April Natural, who is the director of the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, is now working as a consultant and is working at SAMHSA's Disaster Technical Assistance Center. April, I'm not sure if you're on the phone. Are you there?
I am, John.
All right,
Good morning, everybody.
So April is here, and she also can answer a few questions as needed. But the acting director now for the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, as well as this supplemental grant, at this point is Christian Burgess, and Christian has been doing a yeoman's job, an amazing job, frankly, working as the training coordinator for the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, and we're so pleased to have you here, Christian, helping us out with this very big RFP. Christian, you want to take it from here?
You got it, and thanks, John, and again, welcome, April. So as we get started, first before I go into the agenda, let me go over a couple of logistics, one of which John has already mentioned. Just a reminder to please have your phone on mute, the handset on mute, when you're not speaking, to minimize any background interference that you may have in your call center there or wherever you're taking the call from. And also have the volume turned down on your computer to minimize any audio feedback that may result from that. There may be some times during the webinar when we hear feedback, when we have that almost like microphone sound to it, but we'll certainly try to keep that to a minimum and not let it delay us in any way. If for any reason you get disconnected from the webinar, you accidentally close out the window or something happens, all you have to do is just log back in. Just follow the same link that was sent to you with the same login information. And similarly, if for any reason you get disconnected from the audio portion, just call back in, and there shouldn't be any interruption. This meeting is being recorded, so if you do miss a portion of it, or if you have to drop out at a certain time, if you get called away, or for those of you who are listening to the recording at a future date and aren't here, the entire thing is being recorded and will be sent out. A link will be sent out for this. You also may want to share it with any of your colleagues who couldn't join us today. So, and the only other logistic is that we do have a chat function for this webinar. You should see at the top of your screens there's an icon with a person on it raising their hand. If you click on that, I don't know if you can see my computer, but you have options of raising your hand. That's really the only one you would need to use for this webinar. We have, it looks like around 19 or 20 people in the session, pretty small group. What we'll likely do is we do have time saved at the end of the hour for question and answers. However, as we're going through the slides, if you do have a specific question, since it's a small group, just raise your hand and I will call you out. You can also post the question on the chat feature by simply on your right side of your computer in the message board there. I'll type a sample question here, and you just type your question and then press enter, and it'll appear on the screen. So we can also do it that way. If you do raise your hand for audio, then I'll just remember to unmute your handset in order to ask your question. But again, we do have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar if you'd rather save your questions till the end. Any questions about the logistics, you can either chat them or pose them via audio. Any questions about logistics before we get started? Okay. So the agenda for this webinar is, primarily this is a webinar for you as members of the Lifeline call center network. You're here because you have an interest in learning more about the RFP for the Disaster Distress Helpline, or you and your colleagues have already made the decision to apply for the RFP, and you're wanting more information or to hear what other questions there might be. And that's what the hour is for. We're going to be doing a brief overview of the Disaster Distress Helpline, highlighting the roles of the core region centers which are at the heart of this RFP for the Disaster Distress Helpline. We're going to be talking a little bit about Link to Health Solutions and our role in this, and of course going over the RFP requirements. We will be highlighting things from the RFP. We won't be going over it verbatim, word for word. We're just drawing things out because you have most of that information already. But again, if you have the RFP in front of you, if you've had questions that you haven't posed yet, this is the forum for it. So, and John or April, whenever you want to jump in with anything, just feel free to cut me off. No problem. So, why do we have a disaster distress helpline? John touched on this briefly at the beginning of his introduction in terms of the history behind it. Essentially, SAMHSA has funded this project to provide a free, confidential, 24/7 support line that is focused on disaster crisis counseling for any U.S. resident who's experiencing distress as a result of a disaster, either natural or man-made, and I'll touch on that in a moment as well. The Disaster Distress Helpline will be using the same telephony system as the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, which is 1-800-985-5990, as well as the texting function that was in place for the Oil Spill Distress Helpline. We're going to be continuing that for the Disaster Distress Helpline, and the keyword for that is Talk With Us, and the short code is 66746. That will be continuing with the project. We're also continuing the Spanish language texting function, which is Hablanos to 66746. And as we'll see, as you've seen in the RFP and we'll touch on here, we're also, of course, continuing offering Spanish language crisis counseling via phone as well. The Disaster Distress Helpline will be administered by Link to Health Solutions, and again, in a partnership of a network of 4 core regional centers, or CRCs, that will be selected from this RFP process. So the Disaster Distress Helpline will be made up of a network of 4 call centers located strategically throughout the country. I'll go over the map that we created that highlights this later in the webinar, and that is the RFPs that everyone is responding to, is to become one of these 4 core regional centers. So one of the rationales behind creating a dedicated behavioral health line for disasters is simply that the occurrence of natural and man-made disasters in the United States and territories, as we all know, they've increased significantly over the past decade, and there are numerous studies that point to these events having serious psychological impacts on the people who experience them, individuals, families of all ages, and particularly those groups that we know to be vulnerable. Oops, I think somebody needs to lower their volume. We've got some background music here. It's lovely. I think somebody might have put us on hold. Let me type a note here real quick. Okay. All right. Well, so also avoid putting us on hold, although that was really nice music. Okay. So as I was saying, numerous studies have shown the psychological impact on anyone who experiences disasters, but particularly those populations that we know to be vulnerable, those who have experienced disaster before, particularly with the loss involved, whether that's loss of life or loss of property, loss of business, those who are already in the vulnerable margins of society, substance use, other associated mental health illness, and so on. So these are all some of the reasons why we're piloting this National Disaster Distress Helpline for this this coming year. The players in the project will, as I've mentioned, be Linked to Health Solutions, as you all know, the administrator of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, and now the National Disaster Distress Helpline. We are going through the existing Suicide Prevention Lifeline network for this RFP because of the relationships that we've already developed with all of you and the building upon the existing structure that we already have in place with the Lifeline network. What we're calling Transition Disaster Distress Helpline call centers, the 985-5990 number is currently in use for the Oil Spill Distress Helpline through December 28th. However, the Disaster Distress Helpline, we are in a period of what we're calling a soft launch, which was effective October 1st, where when anyone in the country dials 985-5990, they're actually given the option of pressing 1 or pressing 2, pressing 1 for the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, pressing 2 for the National Disaster Distress Helpline, because the funding began on October 1st. Now, we're not publicizing the Disaster Distress Helpline as we're creating the infrastructure. However, SAMHSA did want the line operational, and so if anyone should call seeking the Disaster Distress Helpline, they will get a counselor 24/7, the same as the Oil Spill Distress Helpline. Switchboard of Miami, who is a member of our Oil Spill Distress Helpline network, is serving as one of the transition call centers because they already had the system in place for handling calls from across the country for the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, so they're answering calls for the Press 2 option, the Disaster Distress Helpline, and they will continue to do that through the Oil Spill Distress Helpline and into the new year, into 2012, as we set up the infrastructure for the CRCs, for the permanent Disaster Distress Helpline network. We're also working with the Baton Rouge Crisis Intervention Center, another current member of the Oil Spill Distress Helpline network, to also be a transition call center, simply so that we have a backup call center, Switchboard of Miami, in this transition time, as well as help with any overflow calls that we may receive. So those are our two acting transition disaster distress helpline call centers. They will be in operation up to but no later than February 28th, 2012, anticipating that we may need the first 2 months of 2012 to set up the core region centers once those are selected from this RFP process. The core region centers, as we've already mentioned, there will be 4 of these chosen from this RFP process among the Lifeline, Suicide Prevention Lifeline Network, and they will be strategically placed across the country in regions that I'll explain further in a moment. We're not spending a lot of time discussing what we're calling affected area centers. This is largely something that Linked to Health Solutions will be administering through the Disaster Distress Helpline. However, in brief, when a significant disaster occurs, and that is a bit subjective when we say significant, but we're talking about anything where the size and scope of the disaster has resulted in massive loss of either life or property. And again, that's subjective, but as we move along, we'll continue to work with the key players here in creating more specific criteria. But whenever a major disaster occurs, we're going to use the Disaster Distress Helpline to collaborate with other stakeholders in creating a localized response for that disaster with the nearest call center that's a part of the Lifeline network. That affected area center may not be one of the core region centers. However, it's still a call center that we will work with for a temporary period of time in making sure that we have as localized a response as possible whenever a major disaster occurs. the affected area centers will not be a permanent part of the network. They won't be one of these 4 core region centers. And they will be temporary, the length of time dependent upon the size and scope of disaster, as well as other factors that have yet to be determined. The other key disaster distress helpline stakeholders are SAMHSA as our funder, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, and of course their host U.S. government agency, the Department of Health and Human Services. The FEMA is not a funder of this organization. However, of course, this project, however, of course, will be working with the Federal Emergency Management Agency and coordinating services whenever disasters occur, and primarily we'll also be promoting FEMA services through the Disaster Distress Helpline. So whenever FEMA district regions help centers are created in response to disaster, that will be one of the resources or referrals that we give to callers, and other FEMA resources as they come up will be promoted through the Disaster Distress Helpline. The American Red Cross and the services that they provide in the immediate and long-term aftermath of disasters, will be promoting those services and working with them as a stakeholder. Some other key stakeholders will be state emergency management agencies and state emergency mental health organizations. In coordinating services, organizing resources before a disaster occurs so that they're ready to go after a disaster occurs. And of course, community organizations within each region, within each locality will be important as well. Again, just so that we make sure we have an organized set of resources at all of these levels before, during, and after disaster strike via the Disaster Distress Helpline. So the other key DDH stakeholders, they are not formal partners in this. They're not aside from SAMHSA, they're not funders, but they will be providing key collaborative aspects of this project. The regions that I've been mentioning that will make up the Disaster Distress Helpline, the core region centers, we've created these regions based on FEMA's 10 regions that they have throughout the country. So we group them off according to those regions. So there are any of the states in this map, they don't cross within those zones. We didn't mix up the FEMA regions, in other words, from one to another. We kept their existing structure, but sort of narrowed it down to our structure, which is 4 core region centers. You see them mapped out here. We have Region 1, which is essentially the west and interior west, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. They're listed there on the right of the screen. We have Region 2, which is the southern United States, as well as some of the interior Midwest. We have Region 3, which is the southeastern and mid-Atlantic states. And then we have Region 4, which is the upper Midwest and Northeast. Again, these are based on existing FEMA regions. But we also strategically develop these regions based on the average number of disasters that have been declared by FEMA over the past 50 years, because we didn't want any one particular region to have the chances against them of having a larger share of disasters occurring in that region. So we wanted to spread that out based on the average number of federally declared disasters as well. The Region 1, you may see, is quite larger than the other 3 regions. And the reason why we ended up grouping it that way is not only because of the fact that they're geographically in proximity to one another, but it's also because that region among all 4 does have the lowest number of average federally declared disasters. And so the size makes up for the lower number of federally declared disasters. So there will be 1 core region center within each of these regions, and each CRC will have calls from the area codes in those regions routed to their call center via the Disaster Distress Helpline. The same structure will be set up for text. So whenever a texter uses their smartphone, their mobile phone, to send a text message using Talk With Us or Oblanos to 66746, actually, let me back up. It's not Oblanos, but only Talk With Us to 66746. Based on the user's area code, that will be routed to that call center within that region. that core region center. Correcting myself, the Oblanos actually will be a dedicated microboard only staffed by that core region center that has 24/7 capabilities in having Spanish language counselors respond to those texts. So only one core region center will operate the Oblanos text service outreach component to this. So that won't be based, all text using Oblanos will go to that one. It won't be based on the regions. So that's an overview of the Disaster Distress Helpline. Again, just make note of any questions you have based on the structure, and we'll make time for those at the end. With the RFPs that were sent out, everyone saw the eligibility, but just to go over that quickly, the eligibility begins with Lifeline centers that in Q2 2011 answered at least 250 calls. So we wanted a certain number of call volume in order to be considered for the Disaster Distress Helpline, as well as call centers that were ranked in the top 25% of all Lifeline centers for calls answered, or ranked in the top 25% of centers for call answer rates. So merging those two is how we came up with the initial criteria for eligibility. That's a supporting document on the Lifeline members only website that you all should have access to. If you haven't accessed that yet, then I encourage you to do so. But if you have any, of course, questions regarding that first level of criteria of eligibility, you can pose it at the end of this webinar, or you can we'll follow up on that later. The other criteria to be considered for this RFP is that your call center must operate 24/7. Your call center must maintain an existing information and referral database, which I know most if not all of your call centers do. The information referral database should have the capacity to direct callers to relevant disaster-related services, which essentially are many of the existing resources that you already use for any concern that a caller has: shelter, crisis counseling in the community, food assistance, etc. And it's the information referral database, and we want you to collaborate with active 211 centers in your region that are designated information referral providers. So because you're, again, within that region, we'll need you to be collaborating with 211 call centers that may be in the direct impact area or close to the impact area of a particular disaster. And so it's those things that we're also looking at for eligibility. You have an information referral database, and that you're working with other 211 centers in your region, in the core region center region there on that map, to help coordinate services to callers impacted by disaster. And the third criteria there is that we are asking for call centers to have a minimum of 2 years experience in responding to disasters, which includes incidents of mass violence and/or natural, man-made, or other federally declared disasters. Now, what we mean by that is the Disaster Distress Helpline will be responding to a broad range of disasters. Now, we're not talking about personal disasters such as house fires or more isolated, smaller scale incidents, but we are talking about hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, earthquakes, natural disasters. Incidents of mass violence are things like shootings, bombings, things that all of these of which have an impact on a sizable part of a population, whether it's in a locality, in a state, in an entire region of the country. And when we say other federally declared disasters, we're not just talking about FEMA, although of course FEMA is the primary body in the government. It's a branch of the Department of Homeland Security that issues federal disaster declarations. But other federal agencies, such as SAMHSA, may decide to organize a response to a disaster, and so we're also including that under this criteria here of disaster that the Disaster Distress Helpline responds to. So in this eligibility, the minimum of 2 years experience, we're leaving that up to call centers to decide on how you want to define that. However, it could be that you had received funds to work with a crisis counseling program via FEMA in a past disaster, Hurricane Katrina or another earthquake in your region. the 2 years experience, as it says here, is not necessarily consecutively, so it could have been disasters that had occurred at different points in time, but your collectively, your call center had provided an equivalent of 2 years experience for those disasters, and so on. So that's one of the criteria we had listed, because we're wanting call centers to bring to the project a certain degree of experience in working with disasters. The additional considerations here are that one of the core region centers, among all of the RFPs that we'll be receiving and choosing from, at least one of these that we select will have the 24/7 capacity to respond to Spanish-speaking callers and texters. The texters using the Oblanos keyword that I've already mentioned. The Spanish-speaking, the menu for the Disaster Distress Helpline, as it is currently configured as well for the Oil Spill Distress Helpline, will have an option for those speaking Spanish, and those calls will be routed to one of these call centers. So one of those selected will have 24/7 capacity to respond to Spanish-speaking calls. And then finally, the other eligibility is that each center must be willing and able to serve as the CRC for all the states in the region. We've gone over that in the map that I had up shortly ago. So the roles of the core region centers. Again, I've just extracted some of the key points from the RFP, particularly wanting to focus on 2 areas, staffing and data collection and reporting, which I'll go over in a moment. The staffing component of the core region center, coming into this, when a CRC has been granted funding, we're expecting them to staff the Disaster Distress Helpline 24/7 with crisis counselors. However, your call center staffs your existing lines, whether that's with full-time staff, part-time staff, interns, volunteers. Of course, supervisors and other necessary administrators will need to be a part of it. So using the money provided, there will be an expectation that you'll have the structure to staff the Disaster Distress Helpline 24/7 via the dedicated line that will come through on 985-5990. Because of the texting component, as well as the need to access information and referral databases, the counselors, the crisis counselors, of course, will also need internet and phone access 24/7 and answering calls and text for the Disaster Distress Helpline. The only, we're asking through the funding and as a requirement of this project that core region centers hire one dedicated staff person for the Disaster Distress Helpline, and that will be a full-time outreach and resource development coordinator. As you see here, just to highlight, some of that person's responsibilities will be to develop resource and referral information from within the regions, to conduct regular outreach and build alliances with the key disaster mental health stakeholders that I had mentioned at the start of the webinar, to assist in the coordination of a localized response when disasters occur within their regions, and to coordinate and facilitate trainings for Disaster Distress Helpline staff, the specific trainings of which were included in the RFP, but will be a necessary set of trainings prior to the launch of the Disaster Distress Helpline. So that person, that dedicated staff person, the full-time outreach and resource development coordinator, will be responsible for those things as outlined there. The other staffing responsibility of the core region centers will be to what we're calling staffing up. If a major disaster may occur within the region, there may be a surge in call or text volume anywhere from immediately to 24, 48 hours after the disaster. That may also occur prior to the disaster if it's forecast, if there's a lot of media buildup, if there's been alerts and advisories issued prior to the disaster. So there may be a surge in call and text volume in this period, and so a call center may need to call in additional crisis counselors, and so we're asking that the call centers demonstrate how they would be able to do that, because that will be a requirement of the core region center as well, what we're called staffing up. In terms of the expectations, the roles of the core region centers with data collection and reporting. As per usual with your other hotlines, we're asking that you submit required invoices and reports, but specifically for the Disaster Distress Helpline, and as this is a pilot, this is a pretty important year in our being able to collect necessary information that we in turn will organize and submit to SAMHSA, our funder. And so some of the things that we're asking, that we will be asking the core region centers to provide in reporting will be a narrative of progress towards implementation, when you've hired staff, as you've trained them, etc. As after the award is granted and as we move along towards the full implementation of the Disaster Distress Helpline, if you've encountered any obstacles, and if you have, what are your approaches towards overcoming those obstacles? That will be that kind of narrative will also be included in the report. On a regular basis, we'll be asking that you report the number of disaster-related outreach and education materials that you've identified and collected, as well as disseminated within your region to those key stakeholders, to community groups, etc. Of course, we'll be also concurrently we'll be expecting numbers of individuals exposed to these mental health awareness messages collected via those outreach materials that were distributed. So if you sent 100 information sheets about the Disaster Distress Helpline or associated information to a particular contact, that will be a particular number here. That means that those 100 sheets will have reached 100 individuals at least. And so that will be one of the report things to include in the report. We'll be asking that you report on the description of trainings conducted, the number of individuals who received trainings, the number of outreach contacts made via the Outreach and Resource Development Coordinator, their work and working with the key stakeholders in the region, the emergency management liaisons, the mental health liaisons, etc. And of course, the number of calls and texts. We'll have the existing reporting to get the numbers of the calls and texts that come in. So, but in terms of the referrals, that's something that we're going to need help with the core region centers, because we will want, our funder wants us to record how many referrals we receive, as well as follow-up to referrals in any way that you can record that information. Because again, those things will indicate a certain degree of success with the project and how many callers or texters that we've been able to link with community-based services. So the summary there of reporting is highlighted. It will just involve a detailed description of who provided what services to whom and what context and at what cost. Again, not much of this should be new in terms of your other helplines that you run, but we do want to highlight it here, particularly for the importance of this as a pilot program. This data collection and reporting will be important. Okay, so once you have put together your RFP, again, this is just highlighted from the information that was already sent out. We will be reviewing and scoring it against those requirements that we've listed in the RFP under the project narrative, which is sections A through D, and the points listings are highlighted there as well. Link to Health Solutions, as other funding opportunities we've sent out, will appoint independent reviewers who they will be responsible for reviewing and scoring the applications, and then of course reporting back to Lifeline with their recommendations. This is a standard, but just as always, make sure that you're reviewing your submission for any deficiencies, because that may delay or prevent the grant award. And of course, the sections A through D, as stated here, may not exceed 8 pages. The Section A, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You already have this in the information that was sent out previously. The first section is progress to date. We're just asking you to provide narrative, the history of the work that you've done with disasters already, the existing collaborations or participation with key stakeholders that you have, etc. Section B, proposed approach for core region center implementation. This is just your way of explaining and elaborating upon how you plan on meeting those roles that I had described before in terms of staffing, the challenges that you may anticipate to this, etc. Section C, there's the section on implementation plan and staffing. And then Section D is how you will meet the role of the expectations regarding performance assessment, data collection. So the supporting documentation, the budget and budget justification, as was mentioned, and as you've read in the materials sent out, the detailed budget for $160,000. And it also, in the materials that we sent out, it provides the payment schedule for that amount. With this submission, you'll be providing the narrative justification of the items, description of existing resources and other support in this section of the submission. This other note here, the reimbursements, we're separate from the budget, we're having a separate pool of up to $25,000 per center, which is through September 30th, 2012, which is the end date of this the first funding period for this project. This will be a pool that the core region centers can draw upon for travel expenses to conduct outreach. That may be attending statewide meetings within the regions, attending other events that the core region center deems necessary in order to provide outreach and develop alliances for the Disaster Distress Helpline. So we have a separate pool of money for that, up to $25,000 per call center, and those will be given via reimbursements, and all the necessary paperwork for that is detailed in the RFP. The other mention here, the indirect cost should not exceed 15%. That's fairly standard. And the other logistics here, you already have in your RFP in the information that was already sent out. Everything was sent out October 24th. You have the ability to access the forms if you need additional copies on the Lifeline Members Only website. The other materials that are on the Lifeline Members Only website, if you haven't visited it yet, we encourage you to. It has that list that I mentioned at the start of the webinar for the centers, the Lifeline centers that are eligible to apply based on those initial criteria that I went over. It has the map that we went over earlier in this webinar, and that's included in the materials. It has that as a separate document. And then it also has a resource material from a business called Mozio. Mozio is the provider of web-based text messaging software that we've used for the oil spill distress helpline. That was a very successful use of the and almost pilot of the texting. It's a new emerging technology, and we were very satisfied with Mozio, and so we've decided to continue with them as a provider of the web-based text messaging for the disaster distress helpline. So if you're unfamiliar with using texting as an outreach component, you can go to the Lifeline Members Only website and download some of their materials to give you an idea of what that's like, of what the texting component is like. This is just an overview again of the requirements for the application submission, sections A through D. I actually just noticed there's an inconsistency there of 8 pages versus 10 pages, so I'll make sure to clear that up with internally. The 10 pages may be inclusive of the supporting documentation and the budget and budget justification, but I'll make sure that that is made specific. But you see everything out, the abstract, project narrative, 8 to 10 pages total. Again, I'll clear that up. Sections A through D include, and then any supporting documentation that you submit, as well as budget and budget justification for the submission. Between now and December 1st, which is the deadline for submission, if you do have any technical assistance, questions, anything regarding the RFP, you can email me at the information provided there, but also that was in the materials already sent out. Any questions that I receive, including any questions that we receive in this webinar, we will post those via a frequently asked questions on a blog on the members only Lifeline site, the website which is there. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. The applications will be reviewed according to evaluation criteria that we've gone over, and the decisions will be based on the strengths and weaknesses of the application as identified by the reviewers, as well as by the availability of overall funds. But that's a standard disclaimer for these things. Once decisions have been made for the award notices, you'll receive a notice of award via email, and that will be the obligating document that allows your center to receive this additional Lifeline stipend for work on the grant project. And then finally, the application is due by noon on Monday, December 1st. So we have about a window of 5 weeks here from the date that we sent out the RFP on October 24th. You will send your completed applications via email to the Lifeline Administrative Assistant Linda Gunderson. Her email is stated here. And then again, you'll receive a confirmation email that your application has been received. So that is a snapshot of highlights from the RFP that was sent out, as well as the overall project for the Disaster Distress Helpline. And at this point, in the remaining 15 minutes of the time we have here, I'd like to entertain questions. And again, you can either raise your hand using the top of the screen, and I've seen the first one raised here, so I see that, and I'll call on that person in a moment. Or you can chat your question using the right-hand box, and I will make sure to get that as well. So when I call on you, just make sure, again, that you unmute your phone. And in asking the questions, it will be either myself or John or April that will jump in to provide an answer. So Jeff Struchtmeyer from Switchboard of Miami, I have you raising your hand.
Great. Hi.
Go ahead.
The outreach material, is that going to be something we need to include in our budget that we submit, or is that going to be given to us from Lifeline?
Okay.
I'm really wanting to know.
Okay. I'm just making notes here as we're talking. So the outreach materials will, this is one of the plans for the Disaster Distress Helpline is to not launch a full-fledged marketing campaign as was done with the Oil Spill Distress Helpline and as may have been done through other helplines that you run. We're going to be relying on the Outreach and Resource Development Coordinator as well as the Link to Health Solutions Disaster Distress Helpline staff to work collaboratively at providing outreach to communities within each region. So the outreach materials, it does not have, there is not a separate funding category for that within the grant for each region. We're not expecting any of that money to be used specifically to create outreach materials. The Disaster Distress Helpline via Link to Health Solutions, we will be providing materials as a part of the project for each core region center to use. But again, in the collaborative nature, each core region center, you may be adapting the materials for your particular region. There may be subsets of populations that speak other languages other than Spanish that we will need to adapt to, but any funds related to that will not be expected to come from your specific pool of money. So to answer your question, the $160,000 grant will not be expected to be used for outreach materials. Largely, those will be provided by Link to Health Solutions. Each core region center may decide to use some of their money for outreach materials, and if so, that will be fine, subject to approval by SAMHSA and by Link to Health Solutions before issuing those materials. So those materials may be something that your core region center decides is necessary for your particular region. These may be resource materials that you want to purchase yourself that's from another source, from another mental health company or so on. That's fine, but it won't be a specific requirement of the funding. Okay. I'm going to go with a chat by Jeremy, and then I'll get to two other questions I see posted here by Sherry and Lynn. Jeremy asked, do you have a sense of how often a regional CRC will be activated? So that's a good question, and it does provide an opportunity for clarification. The CRCs, the 4 core region centers that will be located throughout the country, will always be activated. They will always be receiving calls before, during, and after disasters from the moment that your center is given the funding and develops the infrastructure, and then again, I mentioned earlier in the webinar, we anticipate that the formal launch date will be up to but no later than February 28th. So that's when we expect all the network to be in place, ready to go. All the staff are trained, and we'll do a more formal launch at that date. But at that date, every core region center will always be taking calls from 1-800-985-5990, as well as responding to text via Talk With Us to 66746. So there will never be a dormant role to the core region centers. They won't go offline and then back online once a disaster strikes. These will be the 1-800-985-5990, as well as the Talk With Us, will always be in place for anyone to call whenever a disaster strikes, or even in response to a previous disaster that they may need help with. It could be someone that had lived through, I'm just using as an example, Irene, the tropical storm Irene that, as we all know, impacted much of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. It could be that 6 months from now, someone hears about our service and they want to call to talk with somebody about some distress they're experiencing related to that event. Depending on where they live, that call will go to that region, that core region center, and that will always happen. That will always be an option. So it's not that the core region centers will be activated, because they'll never be deactivated from the formal launch date through September 30th, 2012. Okay, I'm going to call on Sherry for her question.
I actually have two questions.
Okay.
My first kind of relates to what you just mentioned, but I'm assuming that calls will be routed to the regional centers based on area code or some other geographic component. But you mentioned the ability to staff up when there's a surge in calls, and I'm wondering, will each center also be providing backup during those times?
That's a good, yes, we will have an overflow structure in place should any call need to get rerouted, and that will particularly be employed in the event of a significant disaster. So we are asking core region centers to have the ability to staff up when a significant disaster occurs within their region, but as a measure to support that, we'll also have in our telephony structure in place the ability for other core region centers to handle overflow calls in case that that particular core region center where the disaster occurs isn't able to handle the entire call volume for the telephony system.
And my other question is you know, the language that you've been using has been that the hotline is geared towards providing a behavioral health care response to a disaster, a local or a national disaster. But at the same time, you're also talking a lot about information and referral services. And my personal experience has been after a disaster, many people are looking very specifically for resources, information, and referral. And so I'm wondering what the expectation is in terms of providers of the various centers in terms of INR. And I guess what I'm saying is are we expected to kind of be an actual provider of information and referral, because managing those resources can be very intensive, or are we more supposed to have a relationship with an INR that we can refer people to?
Okay, that's a good question. And the helpline is geared towards behavioral health, and one of our primary goals with this is to engage callers or texters to get to the emotional content behind their request for information or services. But as you said, many callers or texters, they'll, in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, in the days, weeks, or months, they're calling with a specific purpose in mind to get a particular resource in their community to help them, whether it's help with a reimbursement grant or food or what have you. So there is that dual role that we're asking the core region centers to have, where we're training them and asking them to be prepared for disaster crisis counseling to address the behavioral health needs of callers and texters. as well as, yes, we are asking that the core region centers be equipped to have the information referral databases to be able to connect callers and texters with localized resources in the event of a disaster. And that is, it's both. It's not only having that database yourself, but also being able to collaborate with other 211 centers in the region, again, that may be closest to the impact area of that disaster in connecting callers and texters with services. That's part of the affected area center structure that we have and that we haven't spent a lot of time discussing. Those affected area centers will, once they're activated in the immediate aftermath of a significant disaster, those will help ease some of the burden of the core region centers needing to provide those services for callers or texters. So, and in terms of further elaboration on that, just when we post these responses in the FAQ on the members only website, if we expound upon it in any way, we'll have it there. I'm going to go to, I have Lynn and then I have Al. Lynn, question?
So I also have two questions, which I guess one is Al's question as well, is what happens after September 30th. If this line for the core regional centers will be operational from March to September, what's anticipated to happen after September 30th?
Okay. Well, the funding currently is through September 30th and not after. Final reports and so on would be expected to be issued at that date. However, we are hoping and anticipating that will demonstrate the need for the helpline and that funding will continue past September 30th. So, and of course, as we move along with the project in terms of our relationship with SAMHSA as one of the key stakeholders and the funder of the project, we'll be keeping the core region center abreast of the plans for that, because of course we would likely know about funding by that date, an extension of funding. But yes, so as of now, the funding is through September 30th, 2012 for this as a pilot year for the Disaster Distress Helpline, the fiscal year being October 1st, 2011 through September 30th, 2012. But we are hoping and anticipating that the funding will continue past then.
Okay, and my second question is related to staffing. Is there any idea or guesstimate from the oil spill disaster helpline of what is needed as far as staffing during disasters? You know, I know we're expected to handle obviously a large call volume in between the crisis line and then this will be a separate line. I'm wondering what really is going to be needed during that time and if we'd have the capacity for that.
I think that's a good question as well. Thanks. Partly it's a difficult question to answer because of the sheer variety and the types of disasters that occur, and it being hard to predict exactly what will happen over the next year. We know that it's likely that major disasters will occur given the past 10 years, statistically with disasters. I think that part of it is just to base that on experience that you may have had already with your call center in the aftermath of disasters, and to have that give you an idea of how many additional counselors, call specialists you may have had to have on schedule in the aftermath of those disasters. It will be very similar. But I can't give a specific number, whether it's 5 additional or 10 additional, simply because of the very nature of disasters and how unpredictable they are. But we don't have a set expectation for that. Because of that as well, we don't think that your surge plan should encompass exactly 10 or exactly 5 or however many. We just want, in the submission, we just want the call centers to be able to testify to the fact that they will have a surge plan in place, and that surge plan may be that you'll make a determination at that time as to how many counselors, additional counselors, call specialists may be needed.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering, based on the history of the oil spill disaster helpline, if they've the volume of calls that they've taken and what kind of staffing that they've needed, with that particular. I know all disasters obviously are going to be different and they're unpredictable and all of that. But some baseline information would be helpful, I think, on that.
Okay.
And then I have one more question, actually, regarding the experience.
Sure. Sure.
2 years experience with the disaster, helping out in disasters. If you've really only done local disaster outreach, is that going to be, will you be able to qualify if you haven't done statewide or on a larger scale disaster relief?
Yes. Let me just check just hold on one moment. I believe that, and the short answer to that is yes. We're allowing for a bit of a broad interpretation of that. We do want there to be experience in responding to disasters, but that can be local, it can be state, it can be region. It could be nationally, depending on your particular helpline. So I would, yes, you can focus on local disasters in terms of experience.
Okay. Thank you.
And I have 2 more questions in the couple of minutes we have left. Al, I'm assuming that we got to your question with Lynn's. Just send another chat if that's not the case. Jeff has asked, when is the expected decision date for grant awards? And that is currently our expected date. Of course, this is subject to change, is December 31st. The submissions are due December 1st. Our independent reviewers will begin assessing them immediately after that date, but of course we'll need some time to consider them all and go through them all. So at this point, December 31st is the expected date. And like I said earlier, there's that 2-month period of time for staffing and training before the formal launch, anticipated formal launch of February 1st, 2012. March 1st. And then one more question. In a large-scale disaster, will local crisis centers be funded to support their area for the longer term as they are capable? The affected area centers, we do have a pool of money to provide them with supplemental grants in order to provide localized response to significant disasters. The length of time will depend on the nature of the disaster and other criteria that we'll determine as we move along in the project. So the short answer to that is that the local crisis centers will be funded from Link to Health Solutions, will be the ones granting this money. It won't go through the core region centers that are in that region of the affected area center. And it will, the idea behind those grants is to support not only their response, but to the extent of the size of the disaster longer term. One more question before we have to close out. Is the experience of administrative staff relevant in evaluation? For example, if a call center has little experience with disaster response, but the staff operating the call center has extensive experience in disaster response, is that relevant? The short answer is yes. As long as you can demonstrate that the administrative staff, just put that in your narrative for the experience section, highlighting how the administrative staff can apply that knowledge and experience to the disaster distress helpline. So we have run out of time for this webinar. The answers to the questions, as well as expounding upon any of them if necessary, we will post these on the Lifeline members only website shortly, within 24 hours. And of course, we'll also make the recording of this webinar available to any of your colleagues who couldn't join us or anyone else who couldn't join on the call today. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to reading your submissions.
Thanks everyone.